You were born in 1933 during the Great Depression. Where were you born, and where did you grow up?
Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I lived there until till I was 20, 21.
Yeah. Um, did your dad have work through the Depression?
Yes, he worked for the Minneapolis Gas Company.
When we look back at the World War II period, in the broadest sense, what are some of the main images, some of the main memories you have of that period, the Second World War era?
Well, we didn't go very far because of gasoline not being available, and my parents had a vehicle, and we would often go for Sunday afternoon drives, but that diminished.
During the war?
Yeah,
Yeah.
not completely eliminated, but we chose very carefully about what happened.
Yeah, gas rationing. You've mentioned some things already, but what are other things that were rationed? You just noticed as a kid we're not going out on Sunday drives as much because gas is being rationed. What other kinds of things are being rationed?
Well, I mentioned butter and sugar,
Yeah.
and then the fact that we used stamps, ration stamps, um, and you had to have so many stamps to do certain things. So my
The,
parents got along fine, though.
yeah. These are stamps the government provided, and the stamps, you would use the stamps to, when you purchase things, then the stamp would have to go with it.
Yes,
And then once you used up all the stamps, then that's it, no more of that particular thing.
right.
Wow,
That's
yeah,
that's
yeah,
correct.
yeah. And people who lived through that time say that there was the sense that everybody in the country was in it together. And so even the kids, you say sugar is rationed, so there's less candy, there's less sugar for whatever. Um, but the understanding was that, this is how me as an 8, 9, 10 year old, this is the way I'm fighting the war. Right? Is that accurate? Just the sense that everyone was in the war together?
Yes, yeah, I think definitely.
Did you participate in any of the collection drives? We have pictures of kids going door to door collecting pots and pans, collecting rubber
No
tires, collecting paper. Did you do any of that sort of thing?
paper. We had uh, a Cub Scout group that went out and collected paper
Yeah.
several times, not just on one occasion.
So, these, it doesn't sound like the war, is having a dramatic impact on you personally, right, as a kid. On the other hand, though, you're very active collecting things related to the war. You gave me a stack of letters to look at, and I have a letter here from I think a soldier in the Aleutian Islands, the Alaska Aleutian Islands. There's another letter here where a fellow refers to the China-Burma-India theater. There's a letter here that I guess you wrote to General Henry Arnold or Hap Arnold asking for a patch, and you got a letter back saying, the general's not able to send you one of his patches. I have a letter from Australia that you received. So you're very busy collecting patches during the war, right? What motivated you? And you have some patches here that you can show us. What motivated you to be a great patch collector during the war?
I am not sure. My aunt, her name was Delia, was very active in communicating with our servicemen from church. And it might have come from that stimulus that I got into collecting patches. And as far as posters, that came from my dad. He had a position at the Minneapolis Gas Company, part of which, or a segment of it, had to do with communicating in their building with all of their employees. And that meant communicating, buying posters having to do with buying bonds for the war effort.
Right.
And my Aunt Delia also bought bonds for me in my name, which I turned in 10 years later. They were 10-year war bonds. And so that was a special thing on her part. But she also made, she was also the main person at our church who had contact with all of our servicemen. And so she would relate some of those things to my dad and to us. And I think through her effort and my dad's involvement at work with some of the things related to the war effort, that I just got interested in collecting some of that, and that included posters that were related to war bond drives and posters that were related to to not have a loose mouth during the war effort.
Right, yeah. Yeah, loose lips sink ships, right?
Right.
Now, the impression I have from the letters I've written, the letters I've read, you have a collection of letters from soldiers. As I mentioned, we've got one here from the Aleutians, another came in from Australia, from a lot of different places. I think also one mentions sending you patches of a German that I assume had been captured, and I'm not sure, but that's my impression from the letter, that a German had been captured and the soldier was sending you that German's patches. My impression reading these letters is that you would, just kind of write soldiers, if you happen to be in the soldiers, members of the Air Corps, Navy, Marines. The impression I have is if you just happen to bump into one of these folks, then you'd get around eventually to asking for a patch. Is that how that worked?
Well, pretty much that way.
Yeah.
We lived very near Wold Chamberlain Airport, which is a Minneapolis International Airport now.
Yeah.
But I would go out there. My dad would take me out there, and it was a kind of a pass-through area for servicemen, getting transferred here and there.
Okay.
And so I would go up to a service member and explain what I was collecting, and that did he have any spare patches that he could send back to me or send to me. And many of them, as you can tell from some of these letters, were so very cooperative and interested in a young person doing this.
Sure, yeah.
So many of my patches have been gotten in that manner. But the more interesting stories come from service members who took an interest in what I was doing and just sent on patches, and they would keep my name in their notebook, and they'd keep doing it.
They'd keep sending you patches.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was such a...
Yeah.
Well, I think it was something that they enjoyed, is having this community, this writing relationship with a young person.
Yeah.
And that they could continue that by helping that young person pursue his hobby.
Yeah. So at that time, I mean, is that primarily or only what it was for you? Is just kind of a hobby of collecting interesting stuff? I mean, was there also a sense that you were collecting things that were historically significant too, or did you have that bigger thought, or was it primarily, what I would expect from a kid that, oh, here's another cool patch from my collection, and then maybe 10, 20, 30 years later you realize the historical significance of all this. But at the time, did you have a sense of the historical significance of it?
Not that I remember.
Yeah.
And the reason I think I was doing it at the time was because I knew there was a significant war effort going on, and maybe it was a sense of getting historical perspective on that through patches.
Sure. Yeah.
But I doubt that I was very serious in that regard.
Yeah, not thinking deep thoughts as a
No.
as a kid. I understand that.
This is a General Air Force patch,
Right.
and then it's the 1st Air Force, 2nd, 3rd, that's the 4th,
Yeah.
5th, and 6th, 7th, and so on up to the 20th Air Force. And they included some other things related to the different Air Forces, like down at the bottom here,
Mm-hmm.
armament specialist and engineering specialist, weather specialist, photography, so on.
Yeah.
So they'd be in a particular Air Force, but then they'd have a specialty associated with them.
What is it about the patches that what is it about patches that you find so interesting or so attractive so that you put this time into collecting them?
Well, later on, it was the history associated with, for instance, what the 8th Air Force did. They carried out heavy bomber raids over Europe. And
Yeah, sure.
that was pretty famous Air Force
Right.
activity
Yeah.
at that time. So I did get into some of that even at the time, learning about what the different Air Forces do. I suspect many people today just think of the U.S. Air Force,
Right.
and they don't think of all these different parts of the world, especially during a wartime,
Yeah.
that they would have a composition all their own in that location.
Sure. So these patches are, for you, they're symbols of big stories. Behind these patches are, historically important stories.
Yes,
And these patches symbolize those stories for you.
right.
Yeah, yeah. Something else that you picked up that I've seen is you have a number of books. The one's titled Know Your Warplanes, the other's titled Aeronautics Aircraft Spotter's Handbook, another's titled Aircraft Spotter's Guide. You mentioned that you were near this airport or this airfield. I remember seeing articles published during the Second World War that sound a little fantastic now, such as, I remember seeing one article that the Germans might invade Canada, take over Canada, and then from Canada they would bomb the United States, which seems really unlikely now looking back, but this is what folks worried about. So you obviously had an interest in being able to spot planes as well. Were you only interested in spotting the planes that you could actually see, or did you also practice knowing how to spot German and Japanese planes in case some of those happened to fly over Minneapolis at the time?
I was interested in learning how to spot all different kinds of aircraft, including the enemy aircraft. It's not that we were very active as a group of people, a club or something like that,
Yeah.
but just as an individual wanting to know more about, as I got older, more about what could happen as the warplanes could come over. There were no planes that had the kind of range that could make it to Minneapolis
Yeah.
very conveniently, but anyway, there were. I also was just interested in aircraft, and I drew many pictures of airplanes.
Yeah, you did.
At that age.
Huh.
And so having these spotter handbooks gave me a better perception of what should that airplane look like? What kind of tail markings would it have?
Yeah.
What kind of underwing markings would it have?
Yeah.
And so that's partly why I got all these books related to aircraft spotting.
Did Minneapolis go blackout? Do you recall that? And was there early on in the war when you had to have all the lights blacked out?
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't remember much about it.
But you remember that happened?
Yes.
And there were probably the neighborhood wardens who would go around and make sure that no lights were visible. And
yeah, my dad was a warden.
what does all of this mean to you now? You collected it as a kid, but you've held on to it. And, and as you've said, you've actually, expanded the collection since you were a kid during the war. When you pull this stuff out and look at it, and what does it mean to you now? What does it symbolize to you now?
Well, it tells me that we made a valiant effort in World War II in particular to defeat that enemy. And now it's, as many have said with respect to Afghanistan, now there just doesn't seem to be that unanimity of purpose in fighting a war. And
So it sounds like you're saying that one of the things, these items you have, one of the things they remind you of is of a time in American history when the country was very united.
they were very much so, yes.
Yeah.
And because of the memory of lost ones during that time, my own memory of people from our church, why it stimulates me to be more conscious of what's happening.
One of the names that I saw in several of the letters that I looked at was Nim Sedell. Is that right?
Yes.
Nim Sedell. He was in the Marine Corps.
Yes.
Is that right? Tell us about him.
Well, he was part of our church along with several others, and this is a when he was killed on Iwo Jima, why this was what the church did.
So he was killed during the Battle of Iwo Jima.
Yes.
Yeah.
And she wrote then, "We hold in loving memory and humble appreciation the greater love and supreme sacrifice made by our young friend Nimrod Walter Sedell." And it's signed by the pastor and the chairman of the service committee, which was my aunt. This is just a picture of the honor roll of individuals from our church that had been in the service, most of them in the Army, and that is a picture of this banner.
And there were 3 members of the church who did not survive the war. Is that right?
That died in the war.
This hung in your church.
Yes.
Stars in the form of a cross. Each blue star represents a service member from the church, and the 3 gold stars represent the 3 members of the church who were killed in the war.
That's correct.
And one of them was Nim.
That's right.
What was he like?
He was a very, a young person's mentor type that one looked up to and thought, I'd like to be like him. And he and another fellow from church, they played on the church basketball team too.
Mm.
That made it more personal.
Sure.
Which I and others played on later on as we got old enough to do that.
Mm.
But then we knew that they had gone before us.
You also brought in some posters, and how many? You've got a lot of posters from the war.
Yeah,
as well.
I probably, I don't know, maybe 150.
Wow. Now, you mentioned that these were posters that came into your dad's workplace?
Right. Part of his job description was to communicate current activity with all the other people in the offices there. It was a pretty good-sized office.
Yeah.
And they had several bulletin boards where they would post posters like this.
Yeah, yeah.
And they would cover things like, as far as the nation was concerned, like different bond drives where people were encouraged to buy savings bonds in order to support the war effort.
Yeah.
They'd buy a $25 bond, which they would get $25 when it was redeemed. But at the time it would cost $18.75 or something like that. I forget exactly.
Right. So you're lending the government money. Was it, we'll look at some of your posters. Was it your idea to collect these, or did your dad think, oh, these are important, so I'll collect them? Or did you say, hey, Dad, when you're done with that poster, bring it home?
The latter.
It was your idea.
Yeah. I just wanted to, well, some of them were very, very nicely done. The artwork was so good, and I enjoyed that part of it as well as the message. But I don't expect that the message meant so much to me personally at the time.
Yeah.
Like join the third bond drive or
Yeah, you're not thinking big thoughts, right? It's just, oh, that's a cool looking poster, and yeah. Well, let's look at some of them. They must be a little fragile by now, but you've brought in some of your favorites here.
Right. And
so, yeah, and so you have the gold star, you have the dog indicating that a sailor, because somebody talked. What's the message there? When that poster is made, what message is the government wanting to get across?
Well, they were very concerned about at the time that people would have contact with their own family that were in the service.
Yeah.
People were in the service.
Yeah.
And that they'd talk about it, and then it would eventually get back to the enemy. And so the message about somebody talked and showing, I remember one poster I have, it shows this fellow in a parachute. He's dead, slumping over.
I've seen that, yeah.
And again, the message, somebody talked. So there were quite a few posters reflecting that subject.
Yeah. Yeah, and of course the letters that you received, a lot of them were stamped censored. An officer had to read them, which makes a lot of sense. As a history teacher, it's no fun because the letters tend not to be very interesting because they're not allowed to say, really what's going on. And so, a lot of times the letters will say, everything's fine and we had beans for dinner, but then you look up where he was and that time and you realize there was combat going on or something like that. But yeah, so there's this heavy emphasis, understandable, on not letting information get into the enemy's hands. What's another poster you can show us here? This is another one of your favorites here.
And this is one of the war bond posters
Right.
by War Bonds, third war loan.
Basically, you're lending the government money, and the government will pay you back.
Right.
Yeah.
And,
With
and again, the artwork is so neat on
right.
the young boy. And the other 4 posters I brought have to do with the purpose of fighting this war and buying war bonds. And there was a series of, well, actually Franklin Roosevelt had a speech that emphasized these 4 freedoms. And so each of these is a Norman Rockwell
Right. So one of the 4 freedoms is the freedom of speech, right?
and again
It's a very
focusing
famous image. Yeah.
focusing on buying war bonds to support the war effort, to support saving freedom of speech.
Freedom of speech, yeah.
So I have each of those.
Each of the 4 freedoms. Then this one is this one is freedom of worship, each according to the dictates of his own conscience. Yeah. Wow. And all of these posters you got during the war.
Yes.
So the next one is freedom from want. That's another of the 4
Ours to
freedoms.
fight for.
Ours to fight for, freedom from want. Freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want. Freedom from fear. Yeah, freedom from fear.
And these are all Norman Rockwell paintings.
Yeah. Wow, and you have about 100 of these posters from the Second World War.
Yes.
When you look back on that era, you're born in 1933. When the war's over now, you're heading into adolescence. When you look back on that era, what are the main memories you have of that of I guess your life, but maybe of the United States? And what are the main memories you have of what the country was like at that time?
When we got to 1945, say,
Yeah.
and well, I think for one thing, as I mentioned earlier, people were proud of the effort that we made. And there are a few items I have at home, like a newspaper that has a headline in big bold letters, "Japan surrenders." And the people were very proud of what the United States forces had accomplished in the world. And I do remember that. There's a sensitivity to the fact that this was an earth-shattering time of
Literally, yeah.
winning World War II,
Yeah.
and all that was defeated during that time. And then having a personal relationship with some people that met their demise on my behalf in the war.